Islamic architecture. And let's start with a premise of this course. So let's imagine we're taking a history course or history of art course or history of architecture course in an American college, and we're using a textbook called Jansen. I asked you to get Stockstad. Jansen and Stockstad are very similar, same publisher, same pictures, except Jansen is only Western. So, you know, we go primitive, ancient, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Greece and Rome, Middle Ages, Renaissance, Romanticism, 19th century, modernism, and postmodernism. So, what's wrong with this list? Correct. So, step 2. This is what we did for some time, and we still sort of do it today. Okay, we've got to look at Islamic and Meso and South American, Chinese, Japanese, Indian, and Buddhist. And what tended to happen was, if you look at the textbooks, we talk about Islam right about here because it influences the Renaissance. Might even go back a week and talk about it a week earlier because the pointed arch and Gothic maybe comes from Islam. So, in other words, we introduce Islam at the point where it intersects with European culture. So when did the Europeans find out about Islam, have a real run-in with them? The Crusades, right. And then they bring back spices, silks, sophistication, and a pointed arch from the Crusades. Then, 1492, Columbus comes to the New World, and so now we introduce Meso and South American, and Spain rises to a great power on the gold that they loot from South America. And then Europeans move into the Americas, creating the United States, for example. And so we start, well, let's see what the Indians were about and stuff like that. 19th century, colonization of China, Admiral Perry forcing Japan open to trading. And so now then we start looking at the impact of Japanese aesthetics on, say, Impressionist painting. So we look at China and Japan right about here. England colonizes India, we look at them here. And maybe we look at Buddhism in relationship to postmodern theory. So this is looking at non-Western cultures in terms of how and when they interact with Europe. Alternatively, we can say that there are a series of cultures. Yes, they interact and they have histories and they have wars and there are influences, but they are essentially independent entities. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So Oswald Spengler, who we'll be looking at, says there are 9 high cultures. And these are complexes, so Chinese includes China, Japan, Korea, etc., as a cultural complex. Meso and South American, Teotihuacan, Mayan, Aztec, Incan, as a set of cultural complexes. And you can question that approach, but it's respecting each of these as an independent entity unto itself with its own characteristics. So that's sort of the approach I'm taking. You can think about if you think it makes sense. From that point of view, I've introduced this slide before. And let me just now focus here for a moment. So I'm going to hypothecate that we can roughly say that a high culture begins. You know, it's almost like a group of people get together and say, let's have a high culture. You know, they don't just evolve. You know, hunter-gatherers don't say, you know, it's time to move on and do agriculture. They resist it we saw that Yanomami Indian. She said, I can't stand New Jersey, I'm going home. You know, the Yanomami Indians could all walk out of the jungle and say, we're Brazilian citizens, we demand school. We want our kids to go to college. They don't, because they don't want that. They are, you know, this is our lives, leave us alone. So people get together and say, let's pull off one of these things. And so how do you begin it? And of course I'm speaking metaphorically here. But you begin by laying down an epic poem and a temple form. Say, okay, let's get somebody to write the Iliad and the Odyssey, and let's get somebody to work out what the Greek temple is going to be, and we'll launch Greek culture. And so let's look at two cultures here. And we only have one left in this today, and then this is the last one. And we're not looking, of course, at Greece, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, because you covered that in other courses. So let's look at the Middle East. And we have this, now the epic poem is going to describe the moral structure of the culture. The temple form will describe the spatial experience of the culture. In other words, how you can move around. Now, if you think for a moment, you say, what do you mean? I can move, it's hard to go up and down, let's have stairs, but I can move front, back, left, right. Well, go look at Egyptian architecture. You only move linearly. You don't wander around to the back of an Egyptian temple and say, I wonder what the back looks like. Any more than you say, you know, my parents were masons, maybe let's try to become a baker. No, you did what your family did. You do what your family did. You have a prescribed way of life. So the dome, which we see in the Middle East, the Islamic Dome, the Dome of the Rock, sort of describes the universe as an upside-down soup bowl. And we're in that. We don't sort of go beyond. And you know, it's just this, and it's kind of small. It's a couple of little valleys in the Middle East. They don't think, what would it be like to go around the world? The Greeks did that. And the Greeks said, does anybody, I don't remember, who was the Greek who measured the circumference of the earth? Helps to have a couple slaves, but what he did was, he went down in a well in one place, he went down in a well in another place, get the exact point where the sun was exactly above, and then with a long chain had, you know, measured the exact distance between these two places. It's like 20 miles or something, and did the multiplication, came up with 24,000 miles as the diameter of the earth. Pretty accurate. The Greeks thought that way. Middle Easterns didn't think that. There wasn't anything beyond their valleys. So the dome under which they exist is a very prescribed world. And I'll take as a story indicative of the psychology story of Job. So God's in a bar with Satan, and God says to Satan, behold my subject Job, look at how he worships me. And what does Satan say? Well, before that. Well, of course, look at all what you've given him. He's got all these riches. Take that away from him, see what happens, right? So, what does God say? You're on. Go for it, right? So, first the house collapses, he kills Job's wife and children, and the crops fail. Then his health fails, his body is covered with boils. What's the worst thing that befalls him? Right. The community says that the fact that all these bad things have happened must mean that you've done something bad and displeased God. He says, I didn't do anything. So finally God shows up and says, behold, can thou with a hook pull out Leviathan? I have. What have you done, you puny little worm? And what does Job say? I bow down before you. I have heard of thy name, but now I see thy with mine eyes, and I bow down before you. What might Prometheus say? What might a modern Westerner say? You sicko! What are you doing? What do you pull that stuff for? What's your problem? So, the fundamental principle in these cultures is submission to either the direct word of God or the laws as prescribed in biblical tradition. And in Judaism, you have these rabbis that spend their whole lives going through these books, figuring out. Now, if, Jaime comes into the market square and his cow knocks over a stall and it pokes somebody's eye out, is he liable? Yes. But what if he comes into the market square and his cow bumps another cow, which bumps another cow, which bumps another cow, which knocks over a stall and knocks out somebody's eye, is he liable? And, well, let's try to, well, it's too far removed, and let's go try to reference here and a reference there. And just the law, the word, the written word. Trying to figure it out so that we can put ourselves in obedience to, submission to the Word of God. Now, just to jump ahead, I'm going to suggest that this is true of the biblical traditions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And the Christianity that initially gets to Europe is of that quality. And eventually Christianity in Europe becomes about love and compassion, not about some guy with a beard throwing lightning around saying, this is the law, obey me. And that's a long transition, and that change comes more from Europe than from Christianity. If you look at Christianity in the Middle East, it's still very, if you look at Eastern Orthodox, it's still very law-folk, whereas European Protestantism is very, you find a contact with God through your heart. So, just to contrast that to, we spoke about the others now, in Greece, take as our temple form, a Greek temple, symbolic of the emergence of human beings, separation of human beings from nature, standing above it with crisp geometry, and the emergence of the individual human being from society, symbolized by the columns. And then, so we have this notion of an individual. So then Prometheus steals from the heaven, not only fire, but the arts and sciences to give to humans so that they will not be cold and shivering. And Zeus is really teed off. Why? What's the big deal? The humans are going to use this to overthrow the gods. And that's the prophecy. That, it's a big deal. You idiot! So he changed Prometheus to a rock, and every day an eagle comes and eats out his liver, and every night it regrows. And after some centuries, he's freed by Hercules, half man, half god. But Hercules is hiking through the mountains. He gets attacked by the eagle, and he kills it. And he's dragging this dead eagle with him. He comes to Prometheus and says, "Oh, I'm sorry, was that your eagle?" And Prometheus says, "That's okay." And Hercules says, "You want me to crack open these chains?" He says, "Sure." But before that, a delegation of gods comes to Prometheus and says, "Look, Zeus was just in a bad mood that day. All you have to do is apologize. You don't even have to mean it." And Prometheus says, "You go tell Zeus I spit in his face." So there's this defiance, totally different attitude than Job. But there's still a difference between the Greek humanism and the Western humanism. And that is a acceptance of fate. The Greeks know they cannot escape fate. So what's the ultimate condemnation of fate? We're all going to die. Or, let's just go take a look at these Western people here. I'm director of research for a project called Timeship, and our clients have spent over $100 million to find the genetic cause of aging and just turn it off. I mean, why put up with this? Well, we now have competition. So suppose you're Larry Page or Sergey Brin. You're worth 10, 20, 40 billion dollars. What's the most, what might you be tempted to do with that money? Can Google solve death? They just threw a couple billion dollars into a new division to stop death. What's this aging stuff? Turn it off. Call in a bunch of scientists, say, what do you need? I'll write out a check. That's not a Greek attitude. Only these Westerners would do that. So, okay, Islam. So that's background. And so the point we want to make throughout this course is that different cultures, really think differently. So, Islam begins in the Middle East, arid climate. It spreads eastward, eventually down into Indonesia. It spreads across the top of India, in what's now Pakistan. And a lot of these Islamic people are merchants, traders, so it spreads down into these islands. The spice trade spreads down into Eastern Africa, and the slave trade spreads across North Africa and then up into Spain. So Spain is Islamic for quite a while. And so there's a pincher coming in on Europe from Spain and all the way to Austria. And as a result of this climate, leads to an architecture of mud brick courtyard buildings. So we're beginning here in the Middle East where there is not good stone, unlike Egypt, which does have good stone. Mesopotamian architecture is in mud brick, which is why it all dissolves as the Tigris and Euphrates rivers move around. And so there's this appreciation for the oasis in the desert. So, the desert fosters a reverence for the sky. The earth is hostile. And also if you're nomadic, the thing that stays constant is the positions of the stars for your navigation or your moving, not on water, but just move, well, of course on the water as well. But you move in relation to the stars. Logos-oriented, focus on mystique of numbers, geometry in the word, calligraphy, poetry, the Quran. A real attachment to the word. Nomadic sheep herding cultures until recently. There are pictures just a few years ago of big housing projects in Saudi Arabia, and then for when the whole family comes over and there's a big feast, you have big the equivalent of a big Thanksgiving dinner, you put a tent up out in front of the building, and you're roasting sheep and having all the relatives over in this traditional setting. Arose out of the teaching of the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century. So there were these fiercely independent desert peoples of conflicting religions, and Islam, as taught by Muhammad, was simple, clear, focused, easy to grasp. And so that it provided a means of unification of these otherwise independent desert people. The sacred text is the Quran, which was dictated to Muhammad and written down by him. And in 622, Muhammad fled to Mecca, from Mecca to Medina to escape persecution, and that marks year 1 in the Muslim calendar, which is a lunar calendar. Now, Islam is one of the biblical religions. So, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are the biblical religions. All originate in this Middle Eastern area. And Islam sees itself as a continuation and culmination of these other traditions. In other words, they don't reject the Old Testament and the New Testament. They just said, we've added one more. And it's built upon that. Islam recognizes one God and names that God Allah. So it's not a different God. They don't see their God as a different God than the Christian God. It's just the Arabic name is Allah. Now, this is important to the Islamic world today. It's a very democratic religion. Everyone is equal in the presence of God in the mosque. Everyone is equal in the white ihram on the Hajj. So the Hajj just ended about a week ago. We'll get to that in a minute. But here's the key. There is no hierarchy of clergy. There are respected teachers, but they have no higher metaphysical status than anyone else. There's no pope. So the pope can say in Catholicism, you know what, we were wrong about Galileo, he's been pardoned. The earth does go around the sun. There's nobody in Islam who can say that. No one has that authority. This leads to a conservatism, as there's no one who can say, okay, now there's a new interpretation. Galileo is now innocent. So that makes it difficult for Islam to modernize. I mean, the popes have gone so far as to say evolution is true, science is valid. There's nobody to say that in Islam because it's a democratic, non-hierarchical religion. And there are two types of religion, ethnic religions and world religions. And we said that before. So, Judaism, Hinduism, and Shintoism are ethnic religions. You are Jewish because you're born Jewish. You're Hindu because you're born in India. You're Shinto because you're born in Japan. Very few people convert to these religions. Then there are world religions. Those are for everyone. So Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam each began in one place, but then spread around the world, and anybody can become Buddhist, Christian, or Islamic. Islamic is very easy. You just say, I accept Islam 3 times and you're Islamic. Just to, I shouldn't put anybody down, but there was a fundamentalist Southern Christian leader who at one point said, if English was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for us. In other words, he's not recognizing that Christianity is something that came from the Middle East. It's just his religion. So, Islam. It's what's called the 5 pillars of Islam. These 5 things create Islam. Number 1, submission to Allah. Get back to that. Number 2, pray 5 times a day facing Mecca. So we're starting to see taxi drivers with their little prayer rugs, hop out. And I was once doing something somewhere in Queens. I didn't know anything about this neighborhood. I park and come out, and there's double parking for as far as the eye can see, and I'm blocked in. So what is this? So I go back to where I was having the meeting. They said, oh, there's a mosque down the corner. So I look at the license plate of the car spot blocking me in, and I go, and there's like 300 limo and cab drivers all praying. It's a mosque. They had to stop 5 times a day to pray. Could someone with license plate number figure out to just wait? So you got to pray 5 times a day. Giving alms to the poor, tithing oneself, observing the fast of Ramadan. And so it's a month-long fast, but you can't eat until sundown. And then you have a feast. So you end up doing a lot of eating during this fast. And at least one pilgrimage to Mecca in one's life, the Hajj. Supposed to try to make it. So any questions about these 5 pillars of Islam?
About the second one, does that mean the students who is in school?
Yeah, you're supposed to go off in a corner and pray.
Separately or together?
No, you don't have to be together. They might, if you have a lot of Islamic students at a school, they probably have a student center space where they can go. But if you're caught, oops, you know, the cab driver will just pull over, take out the prayer rug, try to figure out which way is Mecca and pray right there. Now, this is the key one, because, and I'm going to say something you might interpret as critical. This is antithetical to independent critical thought. In other words, you know, that doesn't make sense to me. That's not in their system. You know, it's like Job doesn't say, you sicko, what the hell are you thinking? This is what God wants, this is what we accept. So that's submission. So, praying, here's a student. Whoops, you know, just drop your backpack and pray. And here, I don't know what this is, but, so ideally you want a prayer rug. You don't want to be on the dirt. So you carry a little rolled up prayer rug in your backpack. So these are all prayer rugs. And then one pilgrimage to Mecca. Now, this means we've got a very concentric universe. All of the Islamic world points to one point. Every mosque is aligned to this one point. So Mecca, which is in modern Saudi Arabia, pilgrims visit the central sanctuary of the Kaaba, which contains a meteorite said to have been part of Abraham's temple. So these are all people. The 2 organizations that know more about handling crowds than anybody else are Walt Disney and Saudi Arabia. Because you get about 3 million people showing up here every year. I don't know why it all has to be at the same time, but. And here we see the minarets tapering and the little levels here in your eye. And there's a black meteor in here. Okay, key idea. Islam is anti-iconographic. So, the Bible says, thou shalt make no graven image. Why does the Bible say that? What's the problem with that? And of course, we're starting with the golden calf that everybody was worshiping when Moses came back down from the hill with the 10 Commandments. What are you guys doing? Because you're worshiping the idol, the sculpture, instead of God. God is transcendent. God transcends any object you can make. So if you get hung up on that object, you are missing God. You should be worshiping this transcendent thing, not a sculpture or a painting. Okay, we start with depictions of God are prohibited because you don't want to be worshiping a painting. Worship of an image would be idolatry. You're worshiping the idol and not God. Now, what happens in Islam, this prohibition gets extended to all images. Now you can see where would you get into big trouble in trying to be educated in the modern world? Could you be a doctor without any pictures in your medical textbook? So if, you know, extremely orthodox might prohibit even TV. But this is very often just ignored. So this prohibition is sometimes ignored. There's something called Persian miniatures. Anybody seen the Islamic collection at the Metropolitan Museum? Okay, it's one of the best in the world. It's really magnificent, and if you're at the Met, do stop in and take a quick look around. And they have some Persian miniatures. So, well, if we make them small, it'll be okay. So there are even images of Muhammad in Persian miniatures, and that's a real no-no in some traditions. So, if you don't have representative images, what do you have? Instead, Islamic cultures often use rich, abstract geometric patterns and text from the Quran. Now, before we go on and see this, note that Judaism is sometimes anti-iconography. You don't think of Jewish art. There is some, but it's not a real tradition. Some forms of Protestantism are anti-iconographic. You get Protestant churches that are extremely plain, no cross, no crucifix. But Catholicism is definitely not anti-iconographic. There's sculptures of God. I mean, Michelangelo's painting God with his beard in a Sistine Chapel. There's crucifixes everywhere. There's sculpture everywhere. So we see these different traditions. Thank God for Catholicism, so we have a history of art. So here is a page from a Quran, and the writing becomes beautiful design. This is one of the permitted decorative forms. Here's a dish. Now this is not the one in the Met, but there's one exactly like this in the Metropolitan Museum. And this is lettering from the Quran, and it's always from the Quran, made into this abstract form, working with the geometry of the dish. So these are examples of lettering from the Quran becoming the art form. This is a mihrab, and this one's in the Met. And so we see text from the Quran. So this is richly ornamented, but it's text from the Quran and geometric form, geometric patterns. So I want to say a word about domes. You have an Islamic dome, and conceptually, everybody's under the dome. It isn't like there's one person. So the Islamic dome and the Christian dome, here's St. Peter's, are domes of heaven. They relate one to transcendence. In the Christian theology, we have the Latin cross plan in the Christian church. And so the idea would be the clergy is under the dome, and then we get access to transcendence through the institution of the church, through the clergy. So architecturally, maybe there's not that big a difference, but conceptually, you're directly under the dome, you have access to transcendence. Here in Plato's Villa Rotunda, the dome has a totally different meaning. So you can't really say a dome means this, because here's a totally different meaning. Here, it marks the spot where the human being stands in a humanist notion. And here it's symbolic of government and maybe even imperialism in the American capital. So the dome can have these different meanings. So after the dome, our next feature is mud brick architecture glazed with ceramic tile. Now, this goes all the way back to Mesopotamia. We have mud brick because we do not have good stone in the Middle East. And if you're going to, now our bricks here, they'll last forever. So if you take good clay and you fire it in a kiln, it's very durable. But firing it in a kiln is very expensive in terms of burning a lot of wood, which you don't have a lot of in the Middle East. So you have sun-baked mud brick, and then you put glazed tile, which is expensive in terms of burning a lot of wood, just on the thin layer on the outer surface. where you see it. So to this day, you might find in a mosque, the concrete would be brown, and then you have the glazed tile. So nobody builds in mud brick today anymore unless it's, you know, a deliberately traditional building. But you might make a modern mosque with brown brick in the, or brown concrete or brick in the back, and then glazed tile in the front. We have vertical access to Allah in our minaret, horizontal access to Mecca, and minaret, dome, prayer hall, ablution facilities where you wash before you go in. The mihrab, which is this niche, and Iwan, which is mihrab is the thing that points to Mecca, and the Iwan is the an arched. Now this is not a pointed arch, but usually they are. Typically 4 of them defining an outer square. So we're going to look at several mosque traditions. There's no one Islamic tradition. So let's jump ahead and look at those. So mud brick, ceramic tile ornament, pointed arches, domes and barrel vaults, corbelled squinches, ornamentation based on complex geometries, walled courtyard housing, gardens with pool and fountain as an image of paradise, and Iwans, large rectilinear barrel vaults with monumental arched openings. So, our being in the desert traditionally, our image of paradise is a place where there's gardens, fountains, water. And so we make our houses walled courtyard. I'm going to go too fast for you to write this down, but the slides are online, and if the recording works out, the lecture will be on YouTube. So we're going to look at 5 different traditions, and let's go to each one. So, Ottoman Turkish architecture. What's the most famous example? Correct, Hagia Sophia. So, this is the mosque of Sultan Sultan. So, Hagia Sophia is originally a church and gets converted to a mosque with the Islamic conquest of Constantinople, and it becomes Istanbul. And this is the Mosque of Sultan Suleiman II in that style. So here's Hagia Sophia, and if we want to be historical, imagine that the minarets are not there. So those are added after the Islamic conquest. So this is very mountain-like quality. And we're bringing the forces down. In later architecture, they're able to get these pendentives to work, though all the forces should come down to the ground. But they're moving outward here, so we get these buttresses built later. But later they're able to do it without those buttresses. So this becomes the model for this Turkish approach. So remember, with the Dogon, you had the earthly realm is square, heavenly realm is round. And we want to bring the two into a relationship with each other. It's done with the basket. Here, we do it with pendentives or squinches. So, how do you put a round dome on a square base? And there are 2 ways. One is you fake it. You take your square base, you put your round dome on it, and you hope it doesn't fall down. And it's getting into trouble in these corners, so you put extra wedges in the corner. We'll see those in a minute, and those are called squinches. The other way you do it is a pendentive, which is extremely geometric. So let's do a pendentive. The way you make a pendentive is first you make a circle for your dome, You put a square around that. So there's your square, there's your dome. Now you put a circle around the square and make a dome over that. You then slice off at the square lines, the sides, and slice off the top, and you have what's left is the pendentive. You then put your dome on that, and your force is coming down. So these forces will come right down to the ground. But what about a force here? Well, this is an arch, so that force will get translated down like this. So theoretically, if everything's perfect, this will work. Remember, no tension or bending allowed in masonry design. All the forces have to work in compression coming down to the ground. So that's a pendentive. A squinch is you fill in this corner here and sort of prop it up, and then you fill in the corners of the corners and the corners of the corners, and it becomes extremely ornate. So it can be a source of high degree of ornamentation. So that's a squinch. Those are your two ways of putting a round dome on a square base. Okay, that's Turkish, based on Hagia Sophia. Afro-Islamic, we have one example, which is the Great Mosque of Dinij. So started in 1907, it's in Mali, and kept up to this day. Again, we have to smear stucco over the mud brick to maintain it. Moorish. What's the most famous example of Moorish? Yeah. Hang on a second. Okay, we have a question going back.
Like inside of the ceramic tile is the mud brick?
No, there'll be tile inside too.
What?
There'll be tile inside also. We'll see that in a minute.
I see. Yeah. I just thought maybe they can combine them.
Yeah, no, the front and the inside will have tile. And the example is? Correct. How many people have been to the Alhambra? Great. Okay, so when you go to southern Spain, you go to the Alhambra, Red Castle, Granada, Spain. No, I'm thinking of the Acropolis in Athens, or a Mycenaean fortress town. So it is a fort. It's on a hill. You flatten off the top of the hill, and you put your fortifications up here. This is a Renaissance building, added later. So it's a mosque, palace, and fortress, and it's on a hilly terrace. And this is sort of, okay, 1492, Ferdinand and Isabel not only financed Columbus's 3 rinky-dink ships to come to the Americas, we compared them to a Chinese ship at the same time, but also vowed to drive the Muslim people out of Spain, and they did. So they're moving southward. The last stronghold of the Moors is the Alhambra, and then they're driven out of there. And now it's a tourist place. So you go there, and it's like 100 degrees, and you come into the garden, and the temperature drops like 10, 15 degrees from the evaporative cooling of the fountains. So the fountains are practical, but again, our image of paradise. So these were harems and palaces and etc. Now they're just emptied out buildings. This is one of these elaborate plastered ceilings where the squinch has become ornament. Now this is the Great Mosque in Cordoba, Spain. And here we get a sense of this, I said, a democratic culture, every place is the same. So when you have a dome, so wait a minute, isn't the dome special? Well, conceptually everybody's under the dome. But here we have this sort of anonymous grid. You can imagine thousands of people in here praying all at the same time. So you have these horseshoe dome arches that come around, and again. What's the example of Mughal architecture? Taj Mahal. So, when Islamic culture conquers northern India, it establishes the Mughal Empire. It's a long ongoing period of time. Emperor Shah Jahan commissions this, and always favorite wife is the phrase, so God knows how many he had. But his favorite wife dies in childbirth. He's mourning her and builds this tomb. So it's in the form of a mosque, but it is a tomb. And then he wanted to build another one in black marble, and his son locked them up before he bankrupted the country. And again, we as architects really get off on the geometry of these things. You see a 4-square pattern. Here's the gate. Here's the Taj Mahal. We see the really great crisp geometries of these things. And I like to, it's interesting to parallel this with the Tempietto by Bramante. And here's the tomb. Here's the coffin. Here's the underground tomb chamber. Here's the part that you visit, and this is just here to get the dome higher. To me, this is, very easily symbolic of this world, an upper world, and a lower world, or the conscious, the unconscious, and transcendence. In my mind, if you think Islamic mosque, to me, the image that comes to mind is Persian architecture. So this is Mosque of the Shah in Isfahan. And we have this large city square. So this is where the camel trains come in, through here, and set up their trading tents. It's like a farmer's market, only huge. And there's several mosques around here. This is the Mosque of the Shah, the main one. Here's another mosque. Here's another mosque. And we get this really terrific play with geometry, because this is historical, and then the mosque has to point toward Mecca. So then we get this geometric change of direction. So here's the traditional caravan route. Here's one of the mosques, the Lobell Mosque, and here's an Iwan. It's this flat surface with a sort of half vault into it. Here's the interior of that dome, so there's tile on the interior as well. They use egg whites in the mortar to make it last indefinitely. Makes it very powerful mortar. This is the Mosque of the Shah, and then we have this great geometry here for the change in direction of the joint, and this is for Iwans. Here's the tile dome. Here's the mud brick, not tiled, in the back. Now, just to wind up, a couple of domes, just to enjoy the geometry. Square turned on itself. There's another 8 points, 2 intersecting squares. What's wrong with that last slide? That's Guarini, an Italian Baroque architect in a Catholic church. So you can see the exchange of geometric ideas going back and forth between the Italian Baroque tradition and the Islamic tradition. Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
Speak up so you can hear.
Does the religion makes it much easier to design architecture? I mean, because of the religion, like the Islamic architectures, like the direction is required, and also the functions is all the same, and people's aesthetical standard is all the same. So the more complicated the building is, the greater it is.
Okay. We saw some fairly different architectures, but we think of our world as a big blue marble in space, zipping around the sun in space. And we're pretty comfortable with this notion of space because we've watched a lot of Star Wars and Star Trek and wormholes and stuff like that. That's not how everybody thinks or thought traditionally. So this is a medieval worldview shared in Islam, that this is the earth, surrounded by maybe waters, and then there's this upside down soup bowl over it. And then there are different understandings for why the planets are moving and the sun is moving. So it's a very contained world. Even this, here we go. See, this would be a Greek view, that the earth or the sun is in the center and everything's going around it. But this is more the Islamic view. Here we are, here are the hells, here's the heavens, and there's this vault over us, the firmament. It's an upside down soup bowl with some pinholes in it that are the stars. If this is what you believe the universe is like, it's my contention you're going to make a certain kind of architecture. Those domed Islamic mosques are representations in form of this belief. There were phrases during the 1950s. The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit was a famous novel, and the Organization Man was a book about business organization. And this was the architecture we built. It's a uniform grid. We're all part of an organization. Everybody gets slotted into their little cubbyhole. Now, this is not an office building, but this is sort of a thought about how we think about it today. Well, I don't like to use the word religion. I like to use the word worldview. In other words, what's the world like? For some people, it's scientific and rational. For some people, it's God. I think science is more religion. You know, it's what people believe today. So I want to be more respectful of science than that. But what I'm saying is, you have an idea that everybody's the same. We're all equal. Nobody's special. We all have our role in the organization. That's what that architecture is saying. And now, it's not an office building, but this in a very world. You know, it's like, whoa, where do I fit here? What am I supposed to be doing? What do I hang on to? So these architectures are manifestations in form of the beliefs of the people of that time. And it's my contention that this is what these people believed. It's a little world. You could probably get from one end to the other in 2 weeks. That's the world. That's the universe. That's all there is. And so then, therefore, you make an architecture that looks like it's beautiful. But that's the universe. That's the universe. We all live under this soup bowl. Well, what's beyond the soup bowl? You don't think that way. So how can you not think that way? Well, you know, someone is a proponent of the Big Bang, and you say, well, what happened before the Big Bang? They just get annoyed. Right? Nobody says we have to be logical. There's no rule that says we have to be logical. Now, so this is people who believe this. Now watch. Aha! Something's happening. Somebody says, maybe there is something beyond my little valley. Maybe there's a much bigger world. Maybe I'm allowed to stick my head out there and say, whoa, there's whole other universes. And this is what happens with the Renaissance in Europe. Different notion. And you get people like Galileo and Leonardo and eventually Newton who can think that way. And then they're going to make a totally different architecture. Maybe an architecture that'll look like this. This is not confined to a little world. These are people that are setting ships out to circle the globe. And their architecture is reaching out to infinity. This is the Gardens of Versailles for Louis XIV. So here's the palace, and then the canal just goes on, and it's like on and on to infinity. So these are people who are thinking about a famous story. Just a few years later, Napoleon is the emperor. And a great physicist, follower of Newton, named Laplace, writes a textbook about cosmology, about the workings of the universe. Newton believed he couldn't get his formulas to keep the planet stable. Eventually, the Earth will crash into the sun. So he said, every once in a while, God has to come intervene and, like, get it back on track. Laplace said, no, I'm able to mathematically make it work. I don't need God. I can mathematically keep the planet stable. So he presents his book to Napoleon, who didn't read it, but I'm sure, but was told what to say. And Napoleon says, and where does God fit in your system? To Laplace. And Laplace says, sire, I have no need for that supposition, which is sometimes interpreted as atheistic. In other words, I don't need God. But it's more likely means I don't need, my formulas will work and keep the planet stable. I don't need God to intervene and get them back on track when they start to go off. So these are people that are thinking about vast infinities. Laplace said, if I had a big enough computer and I knew the position and velocity of every particle in the universe, I could calculate the entire future. These people are not in a little valley. And they're making architectures that show it. So that's what I'm trying to say, that in looking at this Islamic architecture, we want to try to imagine their world. Architecture is a manifestation in form of the worldview of a culture. And these people are seeing themselves obeying the Word of God, obeying the rules in a book, in a confined, secure little universe that is under, pardon my saying it this way, an upside-down soup bowl. Very beautiful, very geometric, but that geometry is proving the validity of their system. It's all worked out, it all fits. At one point, I turned this on to slideshow, and it automatically advances. So let me just not go to full frame to avoid that. So I want to get a sense of, the world today, and so let's just zip through a couple thousand years history. So this is the Roman Empire at its height, circling the Mediterranean. And eventually, this becomes too much to manage, and they divide it between the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire. When we get Christianity in 1554, Christianity divides between Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox, Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox. Right at that point, so we have these two worlds here right next to each other. The church splits. The Byzantine Empire is the Greek-speaking Eastern Roman Empire. The Roman Empire falls in the West, but in the East it remains. And it was sort of divided between the Latin world, centered around Italy, and the Greek world, centered around here. Eventually, Islam conquers this, and Constantinople, capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, becomes Istanbul. We then have the Ottoman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire or Byzantine Empire that has been conquered by Islam, facing off against Europe. And Europe is very divided. Spain is united, France is united, England is united. Germany is a lot of tiny little states. And even Italy is separate states. But the Habsburg Empire, which becomes the Austro-Hungarian Empire, is facing this Islamic empire. Islam is moving across North Africa, pushing up into Spain, and pushing in. They've got all of Greece, they've got all of the Balkans, and they're pushing into Europe. 1529, the Ottoman Empire lays siege on Vienna. If they can conquer Vienna, they will conquer all of Europe. Europe will become Islamic. The siege failed. The Christian Europeans resisted the Islamic siege, and this failure signaled the failure of the Ottoman Empire to conquer Europe, and then we have the beginnings of the decline of this Ottoman Empire, this Islamic Ottoman Empire. The Europeans are pushing back. Greece rebels around 1811 to seek its independence from this Ottoman Empire, and then we get World War I. In World War I, the Ottoman Empire allies with Germany against France, England, and eventually the United States. Germany loses. As a result, the Ottoman Empire loses and is dismantled. The Europeans and Americans, this was a period of nationalism that the Czechs, the Slavs, the Greeks, the Romanians, the Jordanians, everybody wanted their own country. They all wanted to be independent. And so, supporting that move for independence, the European powers break up the Ottoman Empire into 39 states, many of which are in turmoil to this day. It's exactly what we're observing going on in the Middle East right today. That the European powers drew the boundaries of Jordan, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq. These were not countries. These are just various provinces of the Ottoman Empire. The Europeans created these countries, maybe not always putting the boundaries in the best places. So today, the turmoil we're seeing in the Middle East is a continuation of this disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. So, one interpretation of, and apologies to any groups, but why are Islamic people so teed off? And one answer is, they used to be a more powerful economically, geographically, militarily than Europe. They were a mighty empire just a few years ago. And then in 1918, end of World War I, they disintegrated. What happened? We want our empire back. Who are these Europeans? So that's one interpretation. It all begins with the division between the Eastern and Western Roman Empire. We're still in a continuation of that to this day. Now, a couple more ideas we have to deal with. And we have to, okay, other sections of this course here now at Pratt focus a lot on post-colonialism. Have any of you spoken to classmates in other sections of this course? And what are they talking about today? Right. And what is the sort of underlying, the key theme? Okay, I'm guessing the key theme is as follows. You are, pick a country, India, whatever. You had 200 years of colonial rule. Now you're independent. How do you create an identity? So, addressing that issue is called post-colonialism. How do you create a psychological, political, architectural identity in the post-colonial world? In a world in which you're no longer a colony of England, or France, or the United States. So the term is post-colonialism. Post-colonialism is a series of theories addressing the legacy of colonial rule. Post-colonialist thinking is part of postmodernism and was formulated in the 1970s. A book by Edward Said called Orientalism is the founding work of this discipline of post-colonialism. Now, Said is Palestinian, so we're addressing this with our discussion of Islamic architecture. Post-colonialism deals with identity in the wake of colonial rule. And it contends that the literature of the colonial powers, for example, Kim by Rudyard Kipling, justifies colonialism by depicting the colonized people as inferior. Colonialism engenders binary thinking, the self and the other. The other is the darker, formerly colonized people, or colonized people if you're writing in the 1800s, who are emotional, juvenile, childlike, and need mature, Western, rational rulers to run their country. So that's the theoretical basis of post-colonialism. So the founding work is Edward Said's Orientalism. Said was a professor at Columbia, and he died just a few years ago, young, from some kind of cancer. He should still be alive today, but it was not old age. So Orientalism is a study of the Near and Far East by Westerners. In other words, the point he's making is Westerners see Near and Far Eastern, here Islamic people, as eroticized and exotic, with negative connotations. So, anybody familiar with Orientalism or post-colonialism previously? So, what did you take from it? What's your take on it? No, from what did you learn about post-colonialism? Okay, I would make two additions. One is not just the Middle East, but the whole world is colonized. Yeah. So Africa, much of China, Indochina, India, etc. And I would also suppose, tell me if I'm wrong, that Lebanon pretty well had it worked out and had a good balance, but as a result of other turmoil, there was a big influx of other people which upset that balance. So Islam was a small minority 50 years ago and is now dominant, and that is not a happy mix. Okay, so that's now we all know what post-colonialism. We did all the other courses in 10 minutes. Just something I wrote a book on the architect Louis Kahn. I studied at Penn when Kahn was there. And so I thought I'd mention the National Assembly building in Bangladesh. So this was originally commissioned to be the capital of East Pakistan. East Pakistan rebelled and separated from West Pakistan and became an independent country. So this became the capital of Bangladesh. So it's the legislature. So in here are a bunch of seats. This is the assembly hall of the legislature. These are supporting offices. And client says to Khan, at one of the entrances, we need 4,000 square feet of closets. And Khan says, what the hell for? He said, well, for prayer rugs. We're Islamic, so pretty much every time we go in or out of the building, we have to pray. We have to pray 5 times a day. Khan says, you tell me every time you go in or out of the building, you pray? And they said, yeah. He says, well, that means the entrance is a mosque. Let's make it 40,000 square feet. So this is the mosque. And just notice this real cool thing. We architects love this geometry. We have an axis going this way. And then we're just off a little bit going this way. And he accomplishes that by these circles like ball bearings rolling on each other that allow this to tilt for its orientation to Mecca. Also, it's interesting that they got a Jewish architect to do the capital of an Islamic country. Would not happen today. and we spoke about Fadi,